A big question that has been plaguing Hollywood and the entertainment industry in general is what we should do about the revelation that so many influential creators are terrible, terrible people. A lot of people have reacted negatively to the idea of canceling prominent directors, as they believe their work to be invaluable to the medium of film. These people are viewing the development of film as an art form through the great man theory of history, the idea that human history is shaped not by cultural trends and macro circumstances, but by the actions of a few specific great men. This theory assumes that without the actions of unique, one-of-a-kind geniuses, history would be stagnant and undeveloped, and that prominent historical figures are just spontaneously changing the landscape of the world by way of their own inherent inborn greatness rather than by the influences of their surroundings. This way of viewing development tends to go hand in hand with the theory of unilateral evolution, the idea that a society or art form is on a set path of advancement and that the art or social frameworks of the past were not responses to the specific needs and interests of the people of that time period, but stepping stones in a predetermined path of improvement toward an inherent universal standard of perfection. The value placed on great artists or leaders is not in their ability to respond to the specific needs and influences of their surroundings, but in their divine calling to push things further in a predetermined direction. When these theories are applied to an art form, they first assume that certain pieces of art are inherently more advanced and valuable than others, and second, assume that only divinely selected individuals are blessed with the genius to make those predetermined advancements, and the entire art form would be lost without them. I personally think that if you went back in time and stuffed Steven Spielberg, James Cameron, Christopher Nolan, and Jean-Luc Goddard in a gunny sack and chucked it into a lake, film as a medium would not be any worse off. It would be different, but other equally or more talented people would have taken the places that they vacated and shaped the art form in their own way. The influences that shaped their work would still be there to influence and shape the work of others, and while the resulting work would be different than what we have in this timeline, different does not necessarily mean more advanced or degenerate. The idea that there are inherent standards of value that all art is striving towards is, in my opinion, complete bosh. While obviously art in general is valuable, and specific highly influential pieces of art can be a valuable resource for understanding the culture and influences that created them, from the perspective of the advancement of art, I don't think that any one artist has any inherent irreplaceable worth. Because of this, I wrote off the idea that we would be losing anything by not consuming work from shitty people. I was viewing this issue entirely through the lens of how valuable specific works were to art as a whole. I happen to not have any strong personal connection to any of the work of these abusive people. Never seeing another Kevin Spacey movie again is not really something that's a huge deal to me. Discussing his exit from the film and TV industry was entirely a question of whether his work had inherent, indispensable value to the medium, which I don't think it does. I don't like Woody Allen, I've never seen a Roman Polanski movie and don't currently plan to because they all sound like enormous bummers. I think Lars von Trier is a pretentious dickweed with nothing of value to say, and I don't really have strong feelings about the work of Kubrick or Tarantino one way or another. I would have no personal objection to their work disappearing off the face of the earth, so the debate about the value of the work of abusive artists was for me entirely theoretical. And then that all changed when I read a poem. Without getting into too much gory detail, I have a complicated relationship with my parents. They are essentially good people who I think did their best, but as I entered adulthood and looked back on my upbringing, I slowly found that many of the emotional and psychological issues that I had were the direct result of flawed parenting decisions they made, or coping mechanisms to deal with their various unhealthy personality quirks. But they're also people, and parenting is a difficult full-time job, and I largely understood why they made the decisions that they made and acted the way that they did. They were human beings who were under a great deal of stress, who were each carrying around the significant baggage of their own less-than-ideal upbringings. But that understanding didn't change the fact that I still had to live with the consequences of those decisions, and because of this nuance, it was a difficult issue to get closure on. They weren't wife-beater-wearing alcoholics who gave me cigarette burns. I couldn't dramatically call them out and then move across the country and never speak to them again. These are people who I love, that are going to be a significant part of my life for the foreseeable future, but are also directly responsible for a lot of the major problems that I'm going to be stuck dealing with for the foreseeable future. A big dramatic catharsis is not really an option here. It's just a confusing and somewhat contradictory situation that I have to find a way to be okay with. And then I was watching a series of unfortunate events, and Count Olaf quoted the end of this poem.
What's that thing your brother used to say? Man hands on misery to man.
It deepens like a coastal shell.
Get out as early as you can. And don't have any kids yourself.
so I was curious about it, and I looked it up, and I read it.
They fuck you up, your mum and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. They fill you with the faults they had, and add some extra just for you. But they were fucked up in their turn by fools in old-style hats and coats, who half the time were sloppy stern, and half at one another's throats. Man hands on misery to man. It deepens like a coastal shelf. Get out as early as you can, and don't have any kids yourself.
And reading these words made me feel okay. I found catharsis in the comforting pessimism of it. For the first time, the weird, confusing emotional situation I was in, the trauma that I was surrounded by reminders of but could never really address, made sense. I don't know enough about poetry to know if this poem was groundbreaking or influential or critically acclaimed. I haven't the slightest clue whether or not it was indispensably important to the art form. And I don't really care much about that, because these 12 lines have an indescribable value to me. And this is important because this poem was written by a man named Philip Larkin, and Philip Larkin was, according to certain things he wrote and many who knew him personally, a racist, classist, misogynistic piece of shit. This judgment is not a case of applying modern political correctness to a bygone era. Larkin was a bigot even by the standards of his day. This bigotry is present in many of his other poems and letters. He expressed a deep disdain for both minorities and the poor, and believed that those who were not upper-class white people should learn their place and be content with a life of subservience to people like him. Prison for strikers. Bring back the cat. Kick out the N-words. How about that? I want to see them starving, the so-called working class, their wages weekly halving, their women stewing grass. When I drive out each morning, in one of my new suits, I want to find them fawning to clean my car and boots. Larkin was not a product of his time who made a few mistakes. He was an unambiguously disgusting, hateful human being. Though many critics have tried to find one, there is no acceptable excuse that can be applied to the things he believed and wrote. And yet this hatefulness is not present in This Be the Verse. The comfort that it provided me is unchanged. Philip Larkin is dead, and I did not pay his estate any money to read his poetry. He's not benefiting from my patronage the way J.K. Rowling is from the still existent Harry Potter fandom. This is not a question about the ethics of giving financial support and cultural influence to extremely bigoted people. I think that consumers of contemporary media have a moral responsibility to be cognizant of who they allow to have a platform and influence through their patronage, but, again, Philip Larkin is dead. It's not a question of whether I'm giving this genuinely horrendous person financial support or social capital, but whether it's ethical for me to place as much personal value as I do on a piece of his work. And I don't really know the answer to that question. In many cases, an author's prejudices or otherwise gross worldviews can leak through into their work, whether intentionally or unintentionally. And it can be important, if one finds a work to be especially personally valuable or influential, to be aware of what those prejudices are, so that they are cognizant of what they are being influenced by, and where certain elements of a work are stemming from. For example, I have multiple times in the past been a defender of Twilight, as I believe its hate brigade has far more to do with misogyny than the actual quality of the writing. As there are many popular properties aimed at teenage boys that have identical narrative issues but do not receive anywhere near the same level of criticism. That said, I think it is important to be aware that Stephenie Meyer is a deeply conservative Mormon, and that the moral framework that these books are based on is largely built on the values of a religious cult infamous for its systemic misogyny, emotional abuse, and racism. Indulging in the fantasy of having a sexy, dangerous vampire boyfriend is not necessarily relevant to that moral framework, but it is important to be aware that it's there. I am deeply uncomfortable watching movies directed by Luc Besson, not simply because he's a predator who raped a 15-year-old child, but because his fetishization of underage girls is an element that shows up repeatedly in his work, whether it's the sexualization of an adult woman who is presented as naive, childlike, and innocent, or casting an actual 12-year-old in the role of a seductive femme fatale. These choices would not necessarily raise red flags without the knowledge of where they were coming from, but I believe it would be irresponsible to continue to consume his work without at least being aware of what was influencing it, lest the value that we find in it be the product of his pedophilia. But I have studied Larkin's less than savory views, and I genuinely don't think that those views are relevant to This Be the Verse. The value and comfort that I'm finding in it is not a product of Larkin's bigotry, but his own largely unrelated relationship with his parents. I don't believe that there's anything inherently wrong with finding personal value in the works of a terrible person, as long as you are not being dismissive or apologetic of their terribleness, and are self-critical enough to assess whether the value that you are finding in the work is the product of its author's terrible features. I don't think abusive people should continue to have power and influence in the industry. The talents of a single individual are not so unique and valuable as to be worth allowing future abuse to occur and past abuse to go unpunished. And I think that we have a responsibility as fans to be aware of how our viewership gives power and influence to still living creators who are using the money and platforms that we've given them to do shitty, harmful things. But when it comes to works that are already finished, whose creators are not in a position to benefit from our viewership, I think the ethics of their consumption is a personal question. Does the value that we find in a work outweigh the emotional burden that comes with the knowledge of its source?